just a few seconds. In the meantime, if you have the copies of that PDF that I sent out, the Didache, we're going to be working through that again just for the next little bit. Looks like we are headed over to Facebook and YouTube. Well, good. That all that is rolling along smoothly. We are live on those platforms, and I've got the chat app up and running on those platforms. So anyway, all right. If you want to go ahead and pull up the Didache, we're going to be there. And one thing I want to show you real quick before we actually get to some of the newer stuff that I want to do tonight. Let me show you. Actually, give me just a second. I'm going to pull this up. Okay, here's something neat that we didn't look at last time, but I think it'd be kind of neat for us to all see this together. The last couple of weeks we looked at Didache chapter 1, and if you can see here what I've got on the screen, I've got a little chart that shows us some stuff. On the left side, we have some selections from the Sermon on the Mount from Matthew chapter 5. And on we've also those two forward slashes there. When you're talking about biblical studies, specifically the Gospels, and you see those two forward slashes next to each other, that refers to parallel passages or similar material from one of the other Gospel accounts. Usually Matthew, Mark, and Luke, they have a lot of overlap. There's a lot of overlap between Matthew, Mark, and Luke. There's less overlap between those three, commonly referred to as the synoptics, when we're talking about those three together. There's less overlap with the synoptics and the Gospel of John, but we still have some significant overlap, especially with the stuff that Matthew and Luke include. There's a lot of material that Matthew and Luke both include that's not found in the Gospel of Mark. So there's a lot of times where you see information like this, sayings like this attributed to Jesus, or sayings of Jesus. And so this is what we have here. You can see Matthew 5:38 through 42. I've got each of these verses in its own little line here. And you can see on the right side some sections from the Didache that we've looked at last week. So Jesus is citing Old Testament law in Matthew 5:38. You've heard it said, an eye for an eye and tooth for a tooth. The original context of that is the ancient Near Eastern equivalent of a court of law. So the elders at the gates would hear the case. They would assess this. This was not licensed for vigilantism or something along those lines. What was equivalent to what was sort of socially binding and legally binding as our courts of law, they would hash these things out at that time. But in verse 39, do not resist an evildoer. And then if someone strikes you on the right cheek, turn the other also. You can see in the Didache, basically cites this and then adds just a little bit to try to flesh out this idea a little bit more about him, about you being perfect in the sense of complete. Maybe your love is complete when you don't feel the compulsion or when you don't act on the compulsion to retaliate, that sort of thing. And then in verse 40 and 41, you see here, if someone forces you, if someone wants to sue you, take your coat, or someone forces you to go 1 mile. Similar material also in verse 4, chapter 1, verse 4 from the Didache. And then when we take a look at Matthew 5, verse 42 on the left side, give to everyone who begs from you. Didache on the right side of the screen really has a lot to say about that, and it kind of expands on that some, and really has adapts it, I think, faithfully, right? Gives a little bit more details. But what's interesting, notice too, in Didache chapter 1, verse 4, so over here on the right side of the screen, see I've got the word perfect highlighted in yellow. I think that is a reference to what we see in Matthew chapter 5, verse 48, down here at the bottom of the left side of the screen. Be perfect, therefore, as your heavenly Father is perfect. So we have these kind of two different discussions of, or mentions of the word perfect. And I think what the Didache is trying to do is really trying to make use of that in a faithful way. It would be very much like how any Bible teacher today would take what Scripture says and try to find, okay, what's some particular applications of this? How do we, what does this actually look like? Rubber meets the road. What kinds of things do we really see here? So that's just kind of a quick review of what we did last week. Let's take a look now at some stuff from Didache, chapter 2, verses 1 and 2. And I've got that here on the screen as well. Connie, other Connie, glad you could join us tonight. Thank you.
Thank you.
So yeah, all right. Let's have. All right, I've got this up, and we will share screen, and I'll read this for everybody. And this is the first 2 verses of chapter 2. So it's kind of some heavy stuff here. Also, Connie Perez and Easter Bell. Y'all, thanks for joining us on Facebook. Glad to have you with us. All right, so this is the next round of teaching from the Didache. The second commandment of the teaching is, you shall not murder. You shall not commit adultery. You shall not corrupt children. You shall not be sexually immoral. You shall not steal. You shall not practice magic. You shall not engage in sorcery. You shall not abort a child or commit infanticide. You shall not covet your neighbor's possessions. All right. So those are the first 2 verses of chapter 2 here. I want to focus, we'll kind of gradually work our way through some of this material and sort of see, like, what are some biblical parallels for things that are mentioned here. But all right, take a look here. The first 2 things that we've got on this list: you shall not murder, and you shall not commit adultery. Okay, so murder and adultery, prohibitions against murder and adultery. Where in the Bible? Where else in the Bible, or I should say, where in the Bible do you see these 2 things appearing? Is there some famous list of things, of commandments, maybe, where we see? I don't know. I've muted everybody just for the sake of cutting down on audio feedback. If you want to unmute yourself to chime in, please do so. If you want to mention something in the chat, feel free.
10 Commandments.
10 Commandments. Okay, that's kind of low hanging fruit, right?
Exactly.
We were. I was hinting at it pretty strongly, but yeah, 10 Commandments. Just for everyone's reference, right? We don't have to turn there, but for everyone's reference, 10 Commandments. The first time the 10 Commandments show up is in Exodus chapter 20. Okay, so it's kind of neat that, like, the highlight of the book, right? Or one of the, I guess depending on how you look at it, one of the highlights of the book. I mean, you have 19 chapters of, here's what was going on, and then we have the plagues, and then we have more plagues, and then Passover, and then them getting prepared for all this that's happening at Sinai. It's like, if the 10 Commandments, right, are the highlight of the book of Exodus, we've got a long way to go before we actually get there. So 10 Commandments. We also have Jesus mentioning at least murder in Matthew chapter 5, also Matthew chapter 5. So Matthew chapter 5, it's like Jesus kind of runs through some of the most popular ethical commandments of the Old Testament and says, okay, guys, y'all have heard it said this, right? And presumably everybody, all of Jesus's good Jewish listeners would say, yes, we have heard that said before. All right, so you've heard it said this. But here's what that actually means, right? Here's the most radical way we can take that in order to glorify God the most. So Matthew chapter 5 does that a lot. Actually, if you've got a Bible around, yeah, sure, that's right. Adultery comes up when Jesus discusses divorce. That's right. If you've got a Bible around with you, turn to Romans chapter 13. Okay. For those of you who are interested in Christian responses to government and things like that, Romans chapter 13 is your chapter. But Romans chapter 13 has a really fascinating discussion about kind of government operating in its best capacity, right? Government operating in its best capacity. My libertarian friends love to hash out this chapter and talk about what they think it means. Yeah, Easter Bell, appreciate the comment. She said, LOL, the 10 Commandments. You got it. You got it. But here's Paul in Romans chapter 13, verse 9. Verse 9 is verses 9 and 10, really. Let me type that down here in the chat. Romans chapter 13, verses 9 and 10. He says, the commandments, quote, you shall not commit adultery. You shall not murder. You shall not steal. You shall not covet. And any other commandment are summed up in this word: love your neighbor as yourself. Love does no wrong to a neighbor. Therefore, love is the fulfilling of the law. Wow. That is deep. Paul actually gives us a little bit further of an explanation. Jesus basically argues the same thing. Law and the prophets hang on these two commandments: when you love the Lord your God, love your neighbor as yourself. Paul, talking specifically about your interaction with other people, makes the same argument. Paul makes the same argument here. But again, you see, you shall not murder, or you shall not commit adultery, and you shall not murder. Those get mentioned as well here. James chapter 2 and chapter 4 mentions adultery and murder, and also in Revelation chapter 9. So I think it's safe to say the Bible has some very clear things to say about murder and adultery. And the church said amen, right? That's very clear, right? Okay, very clear. And the Didache follows in line exactly with that. Didache takes that consistent witness from the Old Testament through to the New Testament and just rolls right through with that. And so generally, this is something that I think is worth mentioning here. Generally speaking, okay, there are probably, and I think there are probably some small exceptions here and there that we could find if we were all to sit down together and comb through our Bibles. But generally speaking, the New Testament affirms and recommits to the moral law of the Old Testament. All right, so think about the law and divide it into kind of two separate spheres, right? You have the moral law, things like you shall not murder, you shall not commit adultery, you shall not covet, you shall not steal, you shall not bear false witness, things like that. And then you also have ritual law saying, hey, when you're going to make this kind of sacrifice, here's the way to do it. Here's what you need to bring. Here are the acceptable sacrifices for these kinds of sins and things like that. If it's legitimate to kind of separate those two things and say moral law and ritual law, I think consistently the New Testament affirms and recommits to the moral law of the Old Testament. Now, the ritual prescriptions of the Old Testament aren't neglected. They're not dismissed entirely, right? Occasionally we see Paul kind of fulfilling these things even after he has become a believer in Jesus. But they're not at all given pride of place in the teachings of the New Testament. It's this moral aspect. Jesus affirms that kind of thing. You'll strain out a gnat to swallow a camel. You guys are ignoring the weightier matters of the law, stuff like that. Sexual adultery falls under this category of sexual sin, and it actually leads to two other commands against sexual sin here in the Didache. I'm going to pull up the screen for us again. One is very particular and one is pretty general. So we have here, you shall not commit adultery. And then here's a particular one, and then here's a general one. You shall not corrupt children. and you shall not be sexually immoral. All right. You shall not corrupt children, and you shall not be sexually immoral. Now, this word corrupt children, this phrase corrupt children, is there's some technical terms here that are it's tough to it's tough to translate from Greek into sort of a one-to-one correspondence with this one Greek word equals this one English word. That's one of the difficulties of translations. That's why most translations are different in some ways. This word in Greek is actually kind of it's a compound word, and it has two roots to it: child, and this word corruption, like we would think of decay or deterioration or something that's perishing. So think like, oh, I forgot about this block of cheese in the back of my fridge. I pulled it out. Oh, it's this green stuff on it. Oh, it's not blue cheese. It's okay. So like, think about that. All right. So that's literally corruption. But that term also got to be used. Kathy. Okay. Yeah. So Kathy's ahead of me here. Yeah. We'll get to I sent out that PDF, that link to that PDF of the Didache. They actually give a little bit better translation than the one that I've been using. But figuratively, corruption can mean something like depravity or moral destruction, or even in the sense of seduction. And that gets us a little bit closer to what this Greek word is trying to say here. This eventually becomes, when the text that I read for you says, "You shall not corrupt children." This ends up becoming a technical term meaning sexual activity with a child. And in the ancient mindset, a child was somebody that was probably pre-puberty. Okay, that's a very uncomfortable thought to think about. That's a very uncomfortable thing to think about. But we are dealing with the ancient world where this kind of stuff happened. And for us to better understand not just the Bible, but also some of these other things, it's important for us to know kind of what they were talking about, as uncomfortable as it is. And so this is discussion here where we see in the Didache, Kathy, you had mentioned the PDF that I had that I'd sent to everybody. The printed version says, "You shall not be sexually perverse. You shall not be sexually promiscuous." Interesting that they just go with the word perverse there. I guess in a technical sense, it would be perverse to be engaged in sexual activity with a child. I guess that's what they mean by choosing this word perverse, as opposed to simply promiscuity, which would imply, I guess, consenting adults. Anyway, Cheryl mentioned some things that we're going to get to here in just a little bit. Yeah. Here's some discussion that you might not be aware of. We're going to talk briefly about pagan attitudes towards sexuality. All right, so this is non-Jewish, non-Christian, right? So pagan attitudes towards sexuality. This was typical, not every pagan, but typical of ancient Greece and Rome. And Sandy, we'll get to that. Your question, asking about if it was illegal. We'll get to that in just a second. Pagan attitudes towards sexuality. Married men shouldn't sleep around, but if they do, it's their business. What do you think about that? Okay. No surprises, right? Not much has changed in 2,000 years. Okay. All right. So this is pagan attitudes towards sexuality. Slave owners shouldn't sleep with their slaves, but if they do, it's their business. Yeah. Okay. Slave is kind of sometimes in a legal gray area at best. At worst, they're just property. And if you're property, you can't reject your master's advances. You don't legally have the ability to consent or not to consent. Again, pagan attitudes towards sexuality. Married women should only sleep with their husbands, but many didn't. Unmarried women should remain virgins until marriage, but many didn't. In ancient Greece, this is particularly applicable to Greece, right? We tend to talk about the ancient Greece and ancient Greco-Roman, the ancient Greece and Rome as one big thing. That's okay in some instances. In this instance, it's important to draw a distinction here. In ancient Greece, sexual encounters between men and boys or men and teens were not uncommon. All right. Sexual encounters between men and boys or teens were not uncommon. Now, in ancient Rome, that practice had been outlawed. They would make fun of Greeks. Ancient Romans would make fun of Greeks and call it the Greek vice to do that kind of thing. But it still happened even in Rome. Okay. And so when we see this kind of thing, I think it's pretty clear to see what the Christians here writing the Didache are doing. They are protecting people. Sexuality is a wonderful thing, but it can also be a very dangerous thing when used inappropriately, right? It's a wonderful thing when used well. It's a very dangerous thing when used inappropriately. And Christians who sometimes today get roasted for having a very repressive sexual ethic, it's actually quite freeing when you think about it this way. Think about a Christian household. Think about Philemon's household, right? Okay, so Christian household, you have a slave owner, Philemon, one of Paul's good friends. If Philemon is carrying out, if he is living the way that the gospel would have him live, then no slave, male or female, no slave in Philemon's household would have anything to worry about in terms of them being taken advantage of sexually. Because Philemon, if he's living out the gospel, then Philemon wouldn't do that. What an incredibly liberating thing, right? You don't have to worry. If you're a female slave, you don't have to worry about your master's advances. It's actually pretty liberating, not repressive, as is sometimes as a Christian sexual ethic is sometimes caricatured. All right. So that's some of what we got there. Let's take a look really quickly at the next thing that we have here. Let's share my screen with everybody. The very next thing mentioned after "you shall not be sexually immoral" is "you shall not steal." Okay. All right. Quick question for everybody. You shall not steal. How does theft harm others? How can theft harm yourself? What do you think? A little question for reflection here. How does theft harm others? How can theft harm yourself? Or can it? What do you think? How does theft harm others? I'll share something. I was mentioning in class, in my morning class, that when we got to Corpus Christi, we drove all the way from Nashville in one day. It was a very long drive. We left at 7 a.m. in the morning, got here at 1:30 a.m. the next morning. It was around 1:30, or I was laying down in the hotel, in our bed in a hotel room, and I realized I hadn't locked my tailgate, and thought it'll be okay. The parking lot's got plenty of light. Go out the next morning, and a lot of our stuff was missing. It's a smash and grab. Not even smashed because I didn't lock the tailgate. So all of my blazers, like all of my sport jackets for church, they're all gone. And so I have two that I wear today, I wear these days. What was nice though is that I realized it was a very, very poignant reminder that why we were coming down here, right? Clearly, there's a need for the gospel down here in Corpus Christi. So we got a pretty good reminder of that first thing. All right. So Cheryl's mentioned, you're depriving people of their possessions, which might be important for their welfare. Absolutely. Easter Bell has mentioned over here on Facebook, for myself, I could be conscience stricken. For others, something important has been taken away, yeah, you very well could take away something that someone else needs to survive. Here's another thing too that I think especially sort of the ethic that Jesus teaches, right? Jesus is consistently, and Paul and others, Jesus is consistently presenting his ethic of love. And this idea of love toward another should spur you on to meet each other's needs, right? It should spur us on to meet each other's needs, to care for each other, to take care of each other out of love. And so, by taking something by force, you're actually doing the very opposite thing. You're not partnering with somebody in order to provide for each other. And this is a Christian ethic within the church, at least. I think that's what Jesus is presenting here. So by taking something by force, you're actually not partnering with someone to work together. You're depriving each other of an opportunity to build one another up in Christian love, I think. So, yeah. Guy, what do you think? Anybody else? Something else you want to add about theft? Okay, so Cheryl and Kathy have mentioned a couple of other things. Thanks for mentioning these in the chat. Cheryl's mentioned sometimes theft causes people to feel violated, causes anxiety for a long time. The thief has to rationalize that what he does is okay. Yeah, I think that's true. Especially this anxiety, it can have negative effects on more than just physical or economic negative effects on the person who has been stolen from, because they can be less willing maybe to share in the future. Kathy's also mentioned there's value to working for things. That's right. There is real value. There's a real psychological value and spiritual benefit to working. And I would also add to that what I was trying to say earlier, especially when you work with someone else to provide for you and for each other. Because in Christian love, you kind of bind yourselves together. Bind us together with cords that cannot be broken. There's no room for theft in a system like that, if we're going to live out that particular song. Yeah. So, okay. Next thing. Sorry, Kathy's got another. Even Adam and Eve were supposed to work. It's important for humans to be productive. See, that's something that I absolutely love about the Garden of Eden. The more you dig into it, it was, if you've ever had a garden, right? Can you ever just let that garden do its own thing and expect it to be productive or to look good? Now, unless you're going for one of these kinds of gardens where that's what you're supposed to do, right? We just kind of let it happen. that exists, right? But gardens, for them to really shine and be vibrant, you do have to work. There is some expectation of you kind of partnering with like you sort of helping to help creation flourish. I think that's an appropriate way. If any of you have ever had a garden before, yeah, you get that. All right, let's ask this question. This one, I'm interested to see what y'all say, because I know a little bit about some of this kind of stuff just from my own studies, but I'm interested to see what y'all say here. So after "you shall not steal," right down here on the fourth line, "you shall not practice magic, and you shall not engage in sorcery." Okay, so you shall not practice magic, you shall not engage in sorcery. All right. How do you, let me hear your thoughts. How do you define magic? What is, when they say magic and sorcery, anybody want to venture a guess? What are they talking about?
Well, I think it was prevalent then, but also today with astrology and what they call the dark arts. I mean, there are believe in some of that stuff as far as the occult. I
Mhm.
think is something that people are very curious.
Yeah, the term occult really gets used a lot, especially in Christian circles, to describe this kind of thing. Kathy puts it very broadly, right? Putting faith in anything other than God. Yeah. These particular terms that get used in in the in the Greek magic here, and these are all single verbs. So like, there's one single verb in Greek that we translate to practice magic. Um, this this first word, you shall not practice magic. This first thing, it involves sort of special sayings or what we would call incantations or something along those lines, calling on um the pagan gods. All right, so here lowercase g gods, gods and goddesses, calling on gods and goddesses, demons and spirits for your personal advantage or for someone else's disadvantage. And this word, you shall not practice sorcery. Does somebody have the other PDF that I sent y'all? Would you put that in the chat? How do they translate that? This word sorcery here in the version that I've been using refers specifically to mixing up potions, which almost sounds kind of silly, right? It almost sounds stereotypical. Um, how many times did what's her name? Sabrina from Bewitched. How many times did her mom show up and they've got this gigantic cauldron? She was also drinking martinis half the time, or at least something. But anyway, yeah, like that, like we almost think of stuff like that. Oh, it's translated basically the same. That's disappointing. I was hoping for something a little bit juicier than that. But it actually refers to like potions. The Greek word, this is funny. The Greek word here is pharmakeia, where we get our English word pharmacy from. Now, I'm not saying, right? I'm not saying pharmacists are practicing witchcraft or anything. Okay. Cheryl's like, drugs. Yes, that's it. Basically it. The idea of mixing something together to produce some kind of effect. Okay. That's the idea here. It was the mindset. This is a historical mindset, right? So we're dealing with historical perspectives here. It was the mindset of Jews and early Christians from the times of the Old Testament and earlier, meaning when the Old Testament was written, to like from the Old Testament through the New Testament times until really maybe a few hundred years ago, maybe, that you should not mess with these kinds of things because, again, this was the mindset of Jews and Christians, because there are real spiritual forces behind these types of activities that are stronger than you, and you cannot ultimately control them. So that's a fact of history, that this was the mindset of of Jews and Christians for many, many centuries. What do y'all think? Does it surprise you? There's not a right answer here. We're all kind of thinking through this together. What do y'all think? How does this strike you?
I actually, one time at a Halloween party, allowed a woman to read my fortune, give me my fortune by reading my palm. She was doing it. It was kind of like, for me at least, it was a joke.
Yeah.
But she saw something in my palm and told me about it. And later it actually kind of came true. I mean, she predicted or said that there was something in my near future, some kind of a health issue. And sure enough, within a couple of years after that, I had some serious problems with my thyroid and had to have my thyroid removed. And I thought back to that woman when this happened. 'Cause
Yeah.
I thought, so it kind of made me think, I don't think I want to do that anymore.
Yeah, that's fair. That's fair. Um, I'm going to state this as just a fact of my experience from being in school with people from many other parts of the world. Had a great time at Asbury Seminary, where had friends from parts of Africa, Latin and South America, Asia, and it's very interesting to hear their perspective on this kind of thing. Christians from those parts of the world are generally very sensitive to these kinds of issues. It surprises them that so many Western, okay, and I use Western in quotes, right? Because European and North American, that's kind of what I mean by Western, culturally Western, not to necessarily geographically. It surprises them that so many culturally Western Christians have, like Harry Potter and other stuff like that. Now, if we want to talk about Harry Potter, I think there's some differences there that are at least worth digging into, but we don't need to spend a lot of time on that. But it is interesting. I've had enough people who otherwise, like, I know that generally they're not lying. I know they're not liars. I know they're not crazy. Their research and stuff in class, I can check like their papers and things and see that they're rationally thinking individuals. They have family members, personal experiences where local witch doctor from their village. That almost sounds stereotypical, but I hear this enough times from enough people where they don't want to mess with any of that stuff. They don't touch it. They don't want to play with it. They don't want to joke about it. To them, it's very serious, and especially to the ancient mindset, it was also pretty serious. Just a couple of scriptures to mention. Right, we're not going to read these, but we will read something here in just a second. Oh, yeah, Connie, what's up?
I was at a slumber party, and they had a Ouija board, and I saw them, they were putting their hands on it, was traveling all over, it was spelling out words. Mm-hmm. And then it was my turn, and it kept on going to goodbye, and it wouldn't work for me. I thought the other person that had their hand on didn't want to do it with me.
Mm. Yeah.
Anyway, I guess it was
a lot to dig into that.
Protecting me.
Yeah. Yeah. Here's some scriptures. Connie, thanks for sharing. That's I think enough. There are plenty of people who have strange experiences with Ouija boards, but here's some scriptures that I put down in the chat here in Zoom. Let me also throw these on Facebook and YouTube, so we can take a look at some of these, or I'll tell you what they are. Right, you don't have to go looking for these because we're going to read something here in just a second from the book of Acts. In Exodus chapter 7, verse 11, Moses' staff turns to a snake. The Pharaoh's magicians are able to duplicate this. In chapter 22, Pharaoh's magicians are also on a smaller scale able to duplicate turning water to blood. And again, on a smaller scale, Pharaoh's magicians are able to duplicate the presence of frogs. And the way that's described in Exodus, at least according to the New Revised Standard Version, that was the translation I was looking at, it mentions how they were able to do so by their secret arts. Okay, which is what Cheryl was describing earlier. And let's take a look at Acts chapter 19, though. Acts chapter 19, starting in verse 11. This is a fascinating discussion of something that is we'll read and we'll see what happens. All right, I'm going to be reading from the ESV. Let me also put that down here in the chat. Acts chapter 19, starting in verse 11. We'll go through verse 20. So Acts chapter 19, verse 11. Go through verse 20. I've got that in the chat here on Facebook and YouTube and Zoom. And God was doing extraordinary miracles by the hands of Paul, so that even handkerchiefs or aprons that touched his skin were carried away to the sick, and their diseases left them, and the evil spirits came out of them. Then some of the itinerant Jewish exorcists. All right, so here's a group of Jewish guys. They're wandering around. They're performing exorcisms. This was actually common enough, right? Because after you perform the exorcism, what would the person do for you? They would pay you, right? They would pay you. Anyway, then some of the itinerant Jewish exorcists tried to invoke the name of the Lord Jesus over those who had evil spirits, saying, I adjure you by the man Jesus whom Paul proclaims. All right, do you see what's happening here? These guys are attempting to latch on to the power of the name of Jesus and the power demonstrated by the Apostle Paul, right? That's what they're trying to do here, is an issue of power. They're trying to latch onto the power of the name of Jesus because they've seen this Christian do this kind of thing in the name of this man Jesus, whom these guys, by way of implication, they don't know, right? They don't know Jesus. So what they do is they say to these evil spirits, I adjure you by Jesus, whom Paul preaches. They're creating a hierarchy of power. Jesus is obviously the more powerful being. Paul is the lesser powerful being. We'll mention them in order of power. Hopefully that will coerce these spirits to fly out of these people. Verse 14, 7 sons of a Jewish high priest named Sceva were doing this, but the evil spirit answered them. So they've approached this one individual who has a particularly nasty evil spirit in them. And if you know this story, it's actually kind of funny. The evil spirit answered this, Jesus I know, and Paul I recognize. All right, not a surprise, right, that this evil spirit would know who Jesus is. This happens to Jesus enough in the Gospels. I know who you are, Son of God. Why have you come to torment me before the appointed time? Stuff like that. I know Jesus, and I've heard of Paul. Yikes. But who are you? And the man in whom was the evil spirit leapt on them, mastered all of them, and overpowered them, so they fled out of that house naked and wounded. These guys literally had the clothes beaten off of them. 1 against 7, right? Okay, 1 against 7. And this became known to all the residents of Ephesus, both Jews and Greeks. And fear fell upon them all, and the name of the Lord Jesus was praised. Also, many of those who were now believers came, confessing and divulging their practices. And a number of those who had practiced magic arts brought their books together and burned them in the sight of all. And they counted the value of them and found it came to 50,000 pieces of silver. So the word of the Lord continued to increase and prevail mightily. Now, here's what's happening in this story. We get a great little glimpse of how many people in the ancient world thought about magic, specifically magic here, like it was defined earlier, in using names and incantations to try to coerce or persuade spirits to do what you want them to do, right? That's the belief, that you can coerce or persuade spirits to do what you would want them to do. That's what's going on here. So these guys think that if they just employ the name of Jesus and even the name of Paul, they think that they can latch onto the power that Paul appeared to them at least. They were apparently ignorant that Paul was empowered by the Holy Spirit, and they were apparently incapable of doing this. But they tried to latch onto this power, and clearly it backfired on them. It's a pretty sad statement. It's a pretty sad fact of reality today that a lot of young people, I asked someone recently who's younger than I am, I asked her recently, do you know anybody, this person's fairly recently out of high school, did you know anybody who was into magic and stuff like that? And they said, yes, absolutely. Handful of folks, all of whom are teenage girls, all of whom are teenage girls. There's, I don't think I have that link here. There's, I've read a story from 2015 that was commenting on the rise of different versions of witchcraft, different witchcraft religions like Wicca, and how it is appealing almost exclusively, not entirely, but almost entirely to young girls. And the idea is that you have, it's to them, it's the promise or the potential, at least, of power over your surroundings. In the ancient mindset, it was connecting you with spirits and things like that. Still very prevalent today. I think as the US becomes increasingly less Christian, I think that we're going to see more and more kinds of things like this happening, or, we're going to see this kind of thing increase in popularity. It has in some ways, if you know where to find it on social media. Popular rappers talk about them practicing witchcraft, things like that, and these are people that people listen to. So anyway, that's kind of an extended discussion on that, but I know for many of us, it is tempting to say, well, there's nothing to that. It's all, no pun intended, it's all hocus pocus, right? But that is, that might be maybe a limited way to think about it. Sharon, you're absolutely right. The devil's not sleeping. Very true. Very true. Okay, we're near the end of our time, but I did want to mention this last thing because I'm sure many of you saw this on here. So I'm going to share the screen again, and we'll see. This is the last thing. This very last line of the first paragraph there. You shall not abort a child or commit infanticide. Now, I mentioned last week that this was potentially controversial, and I was going to take a historically Christian perspective on this and simply tell you about what the Didache and what early Christians thought about this. Pagan attitudes toward abortion can be found, if you simply know where to look for them, in ancient pagan sources. Abortion, as we call it, was common enough in ancient Greece and Rome. It was more common among the wealthy because it was an expensive process that was very dangerous, but it is still practiced among the poor. According to some of the ancient sources that we have that talk about how people tried to perform abortions and why they would try to do that, we have some motives. And again, this is from our ancient sources, right? This is from our ancient sources, to conceal illicit sexual activity, right? Caesar Augustus, right? So Caesar Augustus, the guy who is Caesar when Jesus is born. Okay, so Caesar Augustus instituted some laws that that were intended to strengthen marriages and families, because at some point during his tenure as Caesar, he noticed that especially among the wealthy classes, fewer people were getting married and they weren't having kids. And he thought that this was actually devastating for the state, for the Roman state. And so he instituted laws penalizing people who, if you could get married and you weren't married, or if you could have kids and you weren't having kids, you'd have tax penalties on you, okay? And so, some of those related to adultery. And so we have some very clear, kinds of things here where, if you know, well, having a child is, having a child out of wedlock is a pretty good sign that you're up to something. So anyway, we mentioned that motives, conceal illicit sexual activity, from our ancient sources, to preserve one's sex appeal. This was especially relevant for, of all people, prostitutes. Right. So again, ancient sources indicate this. Easterbell's asked some good questions about. Sorry, Easterbell, I didn't catch your question earlier about Harry Potter, but you mentioned about abortion. Is there anything in the Bible that says thou shalt not abort? Kathy had mentioned, isn't that covered under murder? The way that the Didache describes it, it describes it as "you shall not murder a child by abortion," and that's how the Greek terms this. Ancient Jews and ancient Christians did perceive it as a type of murder. They would have used that kind of language. So that's how they would have spoken about this, and that's how the Didache speaks about this as well. We can also, there's also other things, other motives. Contraception was generally ineffective back then. There are some sources that indicate that people, some women got abortions for revenge on a divorced husband. And so there's some methods. And some of these are, I'm not going to go into detail about these, but there's some methods, both chemical and mechanical, for performing these kinds of things. There's certain types of drugs or plant-based potions that were supposed to kill an unborn child. There were methods for performing partial birth abortions. There were magical charms, right? So again, we've mentioned magic earlier, and really one of the most grisly things was actually striking the womb, actually hitting the womb in some way. It was rarely safe in terms of medically speaking, right? Rarely medically safe, rarely easy. Still widely practiced. Again, from our sources, pagan mindset indicated that an unborn baby was not a child until it was born, and even then. So that gets us to the second part of that. We said you shall not abort a child. You shall not commit infanticide. Even then, after birth, it was still, I don't want to say acceptable, because it wasn't like everybody was doing this, but it was still, if you had this child and you couldn't take care of it, and you didn't know anybody who needed to adopt or could adopt, who could afford to adopt, it was not uncommon to leave the child, usually on some kind of trash heap or something like that, in hopes that some wild animals would find them. Absolutely tragic, but common enough to need to get mentioned here in the Didache. That would be technically infanticide. And so, Connie.
Did someone ask if the Bible speaks against abortion?
Easterbell had mentioned that in the chat on Facebook.
Okay, I put a passage. God told Jeremiah that he knew him before he was born.
Right.
And Psalm 139 says, "You knit me together in my mother's womb."
Mm-hmm.
So there's a lot of evidence for people's life beginning at conception.
And I think that's one of the reasons why many ancient Jews, not all ancient Jews, but many ancient Jews did believe that, whatever they understood of the process of conception, right? Like I don't know if they thought of it in terms of sperm and egg like we do, because, well, we can see that kind of thing. But however they conceived of that, no pun intended, they did realize that from very early on, at whatever point they were aware that there's something in there, they typically believed it was life. Yeah. That's thank you for mentioning those, Connie. Still, it was common enough, right, for an unborn child. I've got another presentation about what we can learn about the world of the New Testament from private letters that have been found in ancient trash dumps. And it's called Scrapper's Delight. It's actually a fun little presentation about this. And there's a letter in there that it's written from a husband to a wife. The wife is upset because she doesn't think that the husband has remembered her. He's not sending money because he has gone off to, he's left the small village to gone off and to find work in the big city. and he says that, from his last visit home, he is glad to hear that his wife is expecting a child. If it's a boy, keep it, but if it's a girl, expose it. And he just very plainly gives her that kind of advice. It was common enough, really, for ancient pimps to raise young girls to become prostitutes. And one of the things that early Christians got to be known for was that they would rescue these young girls that they found exposed, and they would raise them up as their own kids, in order to save them from lives of prostitution, or from what would most likely happen if they weren't found in time, from being eaten by wild animals. And so during New Testament times, an ancient Christian perspective, ancient Jewish perspective, was that at whatever point they knew that life began, like at whatever point they scientifically knew or could observe that there's something there, they believed that to be life. And there's very clear instructions here in the Didache to avoid destroying that in any way. Yeah. So interesting too that we get to see this very specifically mentioned. Unless I have forgotten something, I don't think the Bible mentions specifically the process that, especially the New Testament. I don't think the Bible mentions specifically this process, but it is covered, as I mentioned, and I think Kathy mentioned this on chat on Facebook. It is covered under this broader umbrella of murder. The way that the Greek speaks of this is, you shall not murder a child in corruption. Now, we mentioned something about corruption earlier, referring to kids. It's a different word. But this is a technical term here. You shall not murder a child in corruption. That is a technical term, meaning you shall not destroy an unborn child. And then, very next thing, it says, and you shall not kill what has been born, which we term as infanticide. So, some heavy stuff here at the end of class. We're at our time. Some heavy stuff here, but again, this is part of the reason why I wanted to have this discussion with us, so we can again see, how early Christians are taking the ethical teaching of the New Testament, right, and seeing they're fleshing out how it applies to other situations that either needed to be rehearsed, like the prescriptions, Galatians 5. 19, 20, and 21. That's the list of vices, works of the flesh. Paul mentions. He specifically mentions magic there, but also seeing how the early Christians were taking the ethical teaching of the New Testament, applying it to situations that are not specifically mentioned, but they're kind of on that trajectory in the New Testament as well. So, Cheryl, you are correct. Some Romans would abandon baby girls. Yeah, that's right. That is. From our sources, we see that happened. So interesting too that a guy like Augustus, who's thoroughly pagan, right? A guy like Augustus, who's thoroughly pagan, was willing to use the force of the state to penalize people for not having children and not getting married. Yeah, very interesting. So anyway, we'll pick up here, and then some of the next stuff we'll kind of move through Didache a little bit faster. I wanted us to get to some of these couple of chapters because just had to get a sense of what's going on. We'll move to some of the more interesting, other more interesting things as we move on here. But anyway, y'all, I appreciate it. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. I love digging through this kind of material because it kind of helps me think. And so anyway. Y'all, everyone have a good night. Happy Mother's Day. And we will see y'all next time. Okay. All right.